There exists within the annals of unexplained phenomena a darker chapter that rarely gets told. While most discussions of unidentified aerial phenomena center on fleeting lights in the night sky or grainy photographs of distant objects, there are cases far more disturbing. These are the accounts of ordinary people whose encounters with the unknown left them not merely mystified, but physically harmed, disfigured, or worse. Tonight, we explore the chilling cases of those who crossed paths with something beyond our understanding and paid the ultimate price. The afternoon of January 7th, 1948, began like any other winter day across the rolling hills of central Kentucky. The temperature hovered around 49 degrees. The skies were partly cloudy, with high-altitude cirrus clouds feathering across the pale blue expanse, and visibility stretched for at least 10 miles in every direction. It was, by all accounts, a fine day for flying. At approximately 20 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the Kentucky State Highway Patrol began receiving a series of unusual telephone calls from concerned citizens scattered across multiple counties. The callers all reported the same thing. A strange object was moving through the skies, something circular and enormous, something they had never seen before and could not identify. The reports were consistent enough and numerous enough that the Highway Patrol felt compelled to contact military authorities. Godman Army Airfield, situated on the grounds of Fort Knox, received word of the sightings within minutes. The base was home to some of the most restricted airspace in the nation, and the presence of an unidentified aircraft in the vicinity was no small matter. By 1:45 that afternoon, the control tower's own operators had spotted the object themselves, describing it as neither an aircraft nor a weather balloon, but something else entirely, something they could not explain. 4 P-51D Mustang fighters from the 165th Fighter Squadron of the Kentucky Air National Guard happened to be in the area at that very moment, returning from a training exercise. The decision was made to divert them toward the unknown object for a closer look. Flight leader Captain Thomas Francis Mantell Jr. acknowledged the request and altered his course accordingly. Thomas Mantell was no novice in the cockpit. Born on June 30th, 1922, in Franklin, Kentucky, he had grown up with aviation in his blood. By the time he found himself climbing toward that mysterious object over Fort Knox, he had logged more than 2,800 flight hours, an impressive total that included considerable combat experience during the Second World War. He had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and 4 air medals for his service during the Battle of Normandy and other operations. His colleagues knew him as a skilled and dependable pilot, the kind of man you wanted leading your formation when circumstances grew uncertain. Yet circumstances on that January afternoon would prove more than uncertain. As Mantell climbed his Mustang higher into the winter sky, ground control watched his blip on their radar screens approach the unknown object. The other pilots in his formation, lacking sufficient oxygen equipment for high-altitude flight, peeled away one by one, leaving Mantell alone in his pursuit. Regulations dictated that pilots without oxygen should not exceed 14,000 feet, yet Mantell continued to climb. The last radio transmission received from Captain Mantell has been the subject of considerable debate and speculation ever since. According to some accounts, he described the object as metallic and tremendous in size. Others maintain he reported seeing something that appeared to reflect sunlight, something massive hovering just above him. Whatever his exact words, they would be his last. At approximately 3:15 that afternoon, Mantell's Mustang reached an altitude somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 feet. Without supplemental oxygen, The thin air at that altitude would have starved his brain of the oxygen it needed to function. Hypoxia sets in gradually at first, bringing a sense of euphoria and impaired judgment before progressing to unconsciousness. Once Mantell blacked out, his aircraft would have continued on whatever trajectory his final control inputs had established before entering a deadly spiral. Witnesses on the ground near Franklin, Kentucky, reported seeing a Mustang circling in a steep descent before disappearing behind a tree line. At 3:18, the plane slammed into a farm south of town, scattering wreckage across a considerable area. When rescuers reached the scene, they found Thomas Mantell's body amid the twisted metal. His watch had stopped at 3:18, marking the precise moment of impact. The immediate aftermath of Mantell's death saw the United States Air Force scrambling for explanations. The official initial statement suggested that Mantell had been chasing the planet Venus, which happened to be positioned in the same general area of the sky. This explanation satisfied no one, particularly not those who had witnessed the object themselves, and knew perfectly well that Venus, while visible during daylight hours under certain conditions, would never have appeared as a large, hovering, metallic disk. Newspapers across the nation picked up the story, and rumors began spreading faster than officials could contain them. Some whispered that Mantell's plane had been shot down by hostile aliens wielding superior weaponry. Others claimed his body had been found riddled with mysterious holes, or that the wreckage exhibited unusual radioactivity. None of these sensational claims were ever substantiated, but they persisted nonetheless, feeding a growing public fascination with the possibility that visitors from other worlds might not be benevolent. Years later, following the declassification of certain military documents, a more prosaic explanation emerged. The United States Navy had been conducting secret high-altitude balloon experiments as part of a program called Project Skyhook. These balloons, designed to measure radiation levels in the upper atmosphere, were enormous affairs, some swelling to 600 feet in height and 100 feet in diameter at maximum inflation. Made of reflective aluminum and capable of reaching altitudes of 60,000 feet, they would have presented an unusual and potentially confusing sight to anyone observing from below. Evidence suggests that multiple Skyhook balloons had been launched on January 7, 1948, from Clinton County, Ohio, approximately 150 miles northeast of Fort Knox. Wind patterns at the time would have carried them directly into the area where the sightings occurred. An astronomer named Carl Seyfert at Vanderbilt University actually observed one of these objects through binoculars, describing it as a pear-shaped balloon with cables and a basket attached. The truth then appears to be that Thomas Mantell gave his life pursuing a classified military balloon he had no way of identifying. He climbed too high, lost consciousness from oxygen deprivation, and crashed to his death on a Kentucky farm. Yet this explanation, however logical, does little to diminish the historical significance of the incident. The Mantell case marked a turning point in how both the public and the government perceived unidentified flying objects. Before January 1948, UFO reports were often treated as curiosities or jokes, the sort of thing that filled the silly season news columns when nothing else was happening. After a decorated war hero died chasing something in the sky, the mood shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the possibility that UFOs might be real became frightening rather than amusing, and the additional possibility that they might be hostile added an entirely new dimension to the national conversation. Thomas Mantell became the first person whose death was directly connected to a UFO incident in the public mind, regardless of what the object ultimately turned out to be. His family waited years for definitive answers. His widow received conflicting explanations from different Air Force representatives, one telling her that her husband had crashed while flying too low, another claiming the jet had exploded at high altitude. The inconsistencies only deepened the mystery surrounding his death. Today, a historical marker stands near the site of Mantell's crash in Franklin, Kentucky, commemorating the man and the incident that forever changed how America thought about things in the sky that could not be easily explained. The year of Mantell's death would prove to be just the beginning. In the decades that followed, other pilots and witnesses would find themselves face to face with phenomena that defied rational explanation, and some of them would pay a similar price for their encounters. Far across the globe, and more than 3 decades later, another pilot would climb into his cockpit and never return, leaving behind a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. The Bass Strait has earned many names over the centuries, none of them particularly comforting. This treacherous body of water separating mainland Australia from the northern coast of Tasmania has swallowed ships, claimed lives, and spawned legends of strange lights and inexplicable phenomena that stretch back to the earliest days of European settlement. Aboriginal peoples who lived along its shores spoke of it with respect and caution long before any outsider ever arrived. In modern times, some have taken to calling it the Bass Strait Triangle, drawing comparisons to that other infamous triangle of mystery thousands of miles away in the Atlantic. It was into this strange and storied waterway that 20-year-old Frederick Valentich flew his single-engine Cessna 182L on the evening of October 21st, 1978. The conditions that Saturday seemed ideal for his planned journey. The weather was clear, visibility was good, and light winds presented no particular challenge to a pilot of his modest but growing experience. He had logged approximately 150 hours in the air by that point, enough to qualify for a Class 4 instrument rating that permitted him to fly at night under visual meteorological conditions. Frederick was a young man consumed by a passion for aviation. Born on June 9, 1958, he had grown up dreaming of the sky and had pursued that dream with single-minded determination. He had twice applied to join the Royal Australian Air Force, only to be rejected both times due to inadequate educational qualifications. Undeterred, he had obtained his private pilot license in September 1977 and was working toward his commercial certification when he disappeared. His route that evening would take him from Moorabbin Airport in Victoria southward across the Bass Strait to King Island, a distance of approximately 125 nautical miles. He told officials at Moorabbin that he planned to pick up some friends on King Island, though curiously, no one on the island seemed to be expecting him, and he had made no arrangements for runway lights to be switched on for his arrival. Frederick departed Moorabbin at 18:19 local time, establishing radio contact with Melbourne Flight Service Unit as he climbed into the gathering dusk. The flight proceeded normally for the first 40 minutes or so. At 1900 hours, he reported having Cape Otway in sight, that distinctive lighthouse marking the point where mainland Australia fell away and the open waters of the strait began. What happened next has been replayed countless times by investigators, UFO researchers, aviation experts, and curious members of the public ever since. At 7 minutes past 7 that evening, Frederick Valentich radioed Melbourne Flight Service with an unusual inquiry. He asked whether there was any known traffic in his area below 5,000 feet. Flight Service responded that there was no known traffic at that level. Frederick's reply was unexpected. He reported that there was a large, unknown aircraft immediately above him, something with 4 bright lights that had just passed over his position at a speed he estimated to be quite considerable. Melbourne asked if he could identify the aircraft. He could not. Over the following minutes, the young pilot described an object that seemed to be playing games with him, approaching and then withdrawing, circling and hovering, its brilliant lights illuminating the darkness around his small Cessna. The exchange between Frederick Valentik and Melbourne Flight Service that evening was recorded and has been analyzed exhaustively in the decades since. His voice betrayed growing concern as he described the object's erratic behavior. At one point, he reported that it was approaching from the east and appeared to be metallic with a green light. It was not like any conventional aircraft he recognized. At 7:12 that evening, Frederick reported that his engine was running rough. The controller in Melbourne could hear the Cessna's motor coughing and sputtering through the radio transmission. Then came Frederick's final words, spoken calmly, but with an undercurrent of something that might have been fear or wonder, or both. It is not an aircraft. What followed has never been satisfactorily explained. For approximately 17 seconds, the open microphone picked up a strange metallic scraping sound, something the controller later described as completely unlike anything he had ever heard during his years of experience. Then silence. No further transmissions from Frederick Valentik were ever received. The immediate search and rescue operation that followed was extensive. The Royal Australian Air Force dispatched a Lockheed P-3 Orion maritime reconnaissance aircraft. 8 civilian aircraft joined the effort. Ships traversing the strait altered their courses to scan the waters. Over the following days, search teams combed more than 1,000 square miles of ocean and coastline. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no personal effects, no sign whatsoever that Frederick Valentik or his aircraft had ever existed. The Department of Transport investigation into the disappearance concluded only that the cause could not be determined and that the outcome was presumed fatal for the pilot. The file was closed without explanation, one of aviation's enduring mysteries. In the years following Frederick's disappearance, various theories emerged to explain what might have happened that night over the Bass Strait. Some suggested pilot disorientation, proposing that Frederick had become confused in the darkness and had mistaken his own lights reflected in the water for another aircraft while inadvertently flying upside down. This so-called graveyard spiral hypothesis held that he had then crashed into the sea without ever understanding what was happening. Others pointed to Frederick's known fascination with UFOs as potentially significant. His father, Guido Valentik, told reporters after the disappearance that his son had been an ardent believer in unidentified flying objects and had expressed concern about being attacked by them. Just days before his final flight, Frederick had reportedly discussed with his girlfriend the possibility that a UFO might take him away. Whether these conversations reflected genuine premonition or merely the idle speculation of a young man with a vivid imagination remains impossible to determine. 5 years after the disappearance, a piece of evidence washed ashore on Flinders Island that reignited interest in the case. An engine cowl flap, a small but distinctive component from an aircraft, was discovered on the beach. The Bureau of Air Safety Investigation determined that the part came from a Cessna 182, the same model Frederick had been flying, and that its serial numbers fell within the range that included his particular aircraft. The discovery suggested that the plane had indeed crashed into the water, though it provided no insight into why or how. The controller who spoke with Frederick that evening, Steve Roby, has maintained for decades that the young pilot sounded genuine in his concern and that he had no reason to believe Frederick was staging any kind of hoax or publicity stunt. Whatever Frederick Valentik encountered over the Bass Strait, Roby believes it was real and frightening. In 1978, the same year Frederick vanished, the region had experienced a notable uptick in UFO sighting reports. The Cape Otway area, which Frederick had identified as his last landmark before things began going wrong, had been the site of numerous unexplained observations in the months preceding his flight. Residents, lighthouse keepers, police officers, and passing fishermen all reported seeing strange lights and unusual objects in the coastal skies. Whether these reports bore any relationship to what Frederick encountered remains pure speculation. A plaque now stands in the grounds of the Cape Otway Light Station, placed there by Frederick's family and friends to commemorate a young man who never completed his final flight. His body was never recovered. His aircraft remains lost somewhere in the depths of the Bass Strait. And the question of what Frederick Valentik saw in those final terrifying minutes continues to haunt those who study such matters. The official file may be closed, but the mystery remains very much open, one more inexplicable chapter in the long and troubling history of encounters between human beings and things in the sky that should not be there. Just 2 years after Frederick Valentik vanished over Australian waters, another inexplicable death would occur halfway around the world, this time in the rolling hills of northern England, where the body of a missing man would be found under circumstances so bizarre that even the coroner admitted he could not explain them. The Pennine Hills of northern England have long held a reputation for strangeness. For centuries, residents of these windswept moors have reported unusual lights in the sky, mysterious figures glimpsed in the fog, and phenomena that defy easy categorization. The small market town of Todmorden, nestled in the valley where the counties of West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester meet, has earned particular notoriety as Britain's foremost UFO hotspot, a place where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary seems unusually thin. It was in this peculiar region that one of the most disturbing and inexplicable deaths in British history occurred during the summer of 1980, a case that remains officially unsolved more than 4 decades later. Zygmunt Jan Adamski was a 56-year-old retired coal miner who lived a quiet and unremarkable life in the small Yorkshire town of Tingley, near Wakefield. Born in Poland in 1923, he had emigrated to England after the Second World War and had worked for decades at the Lofthouse Colliery before retiring. He lived with his wife, Leocadia, known to friends as Lottie, who suffered from multiple sclerosis and was largely housebound. The couple had been married for nearly 30 years and were known throughout their neighborhood as friendly, unassuming people who kept to themselves and caused no trouble. On the afternoon of Friday, June 6, 1980, Zygmunt left his home at approximately 3:30 to walk to the local shop. He planned to purchase potatoes and other essential supplies for the next day's meals, including food for the wedding of his goddaughter that was scheduled for the following morning. He greeted a neighbor cheerfully as he departed, appearing in good spirits and giving no indication that anything was amiss. The shop was a short walk away, a journey of perhaps 10 minutes at most. Zygmunt Adamski never returned home. When evening arrived and her husband failed to appear, Lottie became concerned. Zygmunt was a creature of habit, a reliable man who would never simply vanish without explanation, especially on the eve of an important family event. She contacted the police, and a search began that evening. His colleagues at the mine found his disappearance completely inexplicable. Everyone who knew him agreed that this was wildly out of character. For 5 days, Zygmunt Adamski's whereabouts remained a complete mystery. Then, on the afternoon of June 11th, a telephone call came into the Todmorden police station, reporting the discovery of a body at Tomlin's coal yard, some 20 miles from Zygmunt's home. Police Constable Alan Godfrey, a respected young officer who had served with distinction and received commendations for his investigative work, was dispatched to the scene. What Godfrey found atop a 10-foot pile of coal in that yard would haunt him for the rest of his life. The body was that of Zygmunt Adamski. He lay on his back with his eyes wide open, an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. The pathologist who later examined him would describe it as the look of someone who had been frightened to death. Yet the physical circumstances surrounding the discovery raised far more questions than they answered. First, there was the matter of how Adamski's body had come to rest atop the coal pile. The heap showed no signs of disturbance. There were no footprints in the coal dust, no marks indicating that anyone had climbed up or dragged a body to that position. It appeared as though Adamski had simply been placed there, gently and carefully, by means unknown. His clothing was disheveled in strange ways. His shirt was missing entirely. His jacket was improperly buttoned, fastened incorrectly, as if someone unfamiliar with such garments had dressed him in a hurry. His wallet, watch, and other personal items were nowhere to be found. Most disturbing of all were the marks on Adamski's body. Strange burn-like wounds covered his head, neck, and shoulders. These injuries appeared to be only about 2 days old, despite the fact that Adamski had been missing for 5 days. The burns had been treated with a thick, gel-like ointment that forensic scientists were unable to identify despite extensive analysis. No one could determine what the substance was or where it might have come from. Adamski's hair had been roughly cropped, cut in a haphazard manner that suggested haste rather than care. Yet despite having been missing for 5 days, he showed only about 1 day's growth of beard, as if time had somehow passed differently for him than for everyone else. The official cause of death was eventually recorded as a heart attack. The coroner who oversaw the inquest, James Turnbull, would later describe the case as the biggest mystery of his career. He refused to rule out any explanation, including the possibility of UFO involvement, simply because he could not determine what had actually happened to Zygmunt Adamski during those missing 5 days. The case might have remained merely a local curiosity had it not been for subsequent events involving the same police officer who discovered Adamski's body. 5 months later, in the early hours of November 28, 1980, PC Alan Godfrey was on patrol in Todmorden when he received a call about missing cattle that had been reported wandering loose on a local council estate. Driving along Burnley Road in search of the cows, Godfrey encountered something that would change his life forever. Hovering just 5 feet above the road surface ahead of him was a massive object, diamond-shaped, approximately 20 feet wide and 14 feet high. It rotated slowly, counterclockwise, and beneath it, leaves and debris swirled in the opposite direction. Black panels that might have been windows encircled its upper portion. Godfrey stopped his patrol car approximately 20 yards from the object and attempted to radio for assistance. His equipment malfunctioned. He reached for his sketch pad and began drawing what he was seeing. A perfectly rational response from a trained investigator confronted with something inexplicable. Then came a blinding flash of light. The next thing Godfrey remembered was sitting in his patrol car some distance farther down Burnley Road, 15 to 30 minutes had simply vanished from his memory. His boots were split, and he had a strange mark on one foot. The object was gone. So were the missing cows, which were later found safely in a field with a locked gate, with no apparent means of entry. Under hypnotic regression administered by separate psychologists on different occasions, Godfrey recalled fragmented memories of being inside a strange room, of being examined on a table by small creatures and a tall, bearded figure in robes. He has always been careful to describe these hypnotically recovered memories as potentially unreliable, possibly dreams rather than actual events. But he has never wavered in his account of what he consciously experienced on that road. The connection between Godfrey's UFO encounter and the death of Zygmunt Adamski has been the subject of endless speculation. Both events occurred in the same small area within a few months of each other. Both involved police officer Alan Godfrey. Both remain officially unexplained. Shortly after speaking publicly about his experiences, Godfrey was approached by a mysterious man who claimed to represent government interests. The man presented Godfrey with a file containing his original sketch of the UFO and demanded that he sign the Official Secrets Act and agree not to discuss what he had seen. Godfrey reluctantly complied. The man continued to follow him for several days before Godfrey finally confronted him in a local pub and told him to leave. The stranger disappeared and was never seen again. Some investigators have proposed that Adamski was abducted by whatever beings operate the craft that Godfrey later encountered, that something went wrong during their examination of him, and that his body was returned to the most convenient location, which happened to be a coal yard in a known UFO hotspot. Others suggest more mundane explanations involving family disputes or criminal activity, though none of these alternative theories adequately account for the bizarre physical evidence. The case remains open. The burns, the unidentified ointment, the missing time, the impossible positioning of the body, the expression of absolute terror on a dead man's face. All of these elements combine to create a mystery that has resisted solution for more than 40 years. Zygmunt Adamski went to buy potatoes on a Friday afternoon in June. What happened to him during the next 5 days, where he went, who or what he encountered, and how he came to die on top of a coal pile miles from his home with strange burns treated by an unknown substance, remains one of the most unsettling, unsolved cases in British history. But if the death of one man in Yorkshire seemed inexplicable, what would unfold 3 years earlier on the other side of the Atlantic would prove even more disturbing, for it involved not a single victim, but an entire community under siege from the skies. The year 1977 brought terror to the Amazon Delta region of northern Brazil, a terror that would be officially investigated by the military, documented in thousands of pages of reports, and then classified for decades before portions finally emerged into public view. What happened on the island of Kinross and in the surrounding villages along the Para coast represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of alleged UFO attacks on civilian populations in recorded history. The events began in the summer of that year, when residents of Kinross, a small fishing community of approximately 2,000 souls, started reporting strange lights in the nighttime sky. These lights were not merely observed from a distance. They descended. They approached. They attacked. The locals gave these mysterious objects a name, chupa chupa, meaning sucker sucker, a reference to the sensation victims described of having their blood or energy somehow drained from their bodies. The lights appeared in various forms, sometimes as elongated cylinders, sometimes as disc-shaped craft, sometimes as mere points of brilliant illumination that moved with purpose and intelligence through the darkness. What set the Kinross incidents apart from typical UFO sighting reports was the physical harm inflicted upon witnesses. Dozens of people, perhaps hundreds by some accounts, reported being struck by beams of light that left real, measurable injuries on their bodies. The wounds were distinctive and consistent across multiple victims. Small puncture marks on the skin, burn-like lesions that resembled radiation damage, and areas where hair fell out and never grew back. Dr. Weleed Sechim Carvalho was a physician working in the region during the outbreak of sightings. She treated more than 35 patients who presented with these unusual injuries, documenting their symptoms with meticulous care. The victims complained of weakness, dizziness, headaches, and a profound sense of having been violated or drained. Their wounds showed intense reddening of the skin that progressed to blackening and tissue damage. Many suffered from symptoms consistent with severe anemia, as if substantial quantities of blood had indeed been removed from their bodies. The terror grew so intense that residents of Kinross organized night vigils, lighting bonfires and setting off fireworks in the desperate hope that the noise and flames might keep the lights away. Women and children were evacuated from the island, while men remained behind to guard their homes and property. The fishing economy, the lifeblood of the community, collapsed as no one dared venture onto the dark waters where the lights were frequently observed. Mayor Jose Ildone Favacho Soero, overwhelmed by the crisis and unable to provide his constituents with answers or protection, made the extraordinary decision to contact military authorities in Brasilia and request assistance. The response was not what the villagers had hoped for. Instead of armed troops to defend against whatever was attacking the population, the Brazilian Air Force dispatched a team of investigators equipped with cameras, film, and scientific instruments. Their mission was designated Operation Saucer, or Opera Cao Prato in Portuguese, and it would become the most extensive military investigation of UFO phenomena ever conducted, while events were still actively unfolding. Captain Wirange Bolivar Soares Nogueira de Holanda Lima commanded the operation, leading his men into a situation none of them had been trained to handle. Over the following 4 months, from late 1977 into early 1978, the team collected thousands of witness testimonies, took approximately 500 photographs, and recorded 15 hours of film footage. They interviewed more than 3,000 individuals who claimed to have observed the phenomena or suffered injuries from the light beams. The military investigators did not merely document second-hand accounts. On multiple occasions, Captain Hollanda and his men observed the lights themselves. They watched unidentified craft emerge from the coastal waters and rise into the sky. They saw objects that moved in ways no conventional aircraft could achieve. They experienced the same fear that had gripped the civilian population. In a 1997 interview with UFO researchers, conducted 20 years after the events, Captain Hollanda broke his long silence about what he had witnessed during Operation Saucer. He described a personal encounter with a humanoid being approximately 1.5 meters tall, dressed in what appeared to be a metallic spacesuit. Unlike the aggressive Chupa Chupa encounters reported by villagers, this being embraced Hollanda from behind and spoke to him in Portuguese with a mechanical, metallic quality to its voice, telling him to take it easy. Hollanda revealed that the phenomena appeared to move systematically across the Brazilian coast and Amazon region, covering the area in strips like aerial photography. Whatever intelligence directed these objects, he concluded, was conducting some form of surveillance or research operation on a massive scale. 3 months after giving this interview, Captain Hollanda was found dead in his home. The official cause was suicide by hanging, using the belt of his bathrobe. His death sparked immediate speculation among UFO researchers that he had been silenced to prevent further disclosure of what he knew. No evidence has ever emerged to support these suspicions, but neither has any satisfactory explanation been offered for why a man who had waited 20 years to tell his story would choose to end his life so shortly after finally doing so. The official findings of Operation Saucer concluded that no unusual phenomena could be confirmed. The case files were classified and locked away. It was not until 2005, following persistent efforts by Brazilian UFO researchers, that portions of the documentation were finally released to the public through Freedom of Information requests. What emerged confirmed many of the accounts that villagers had been telling for decades. The injuries documented during the Colares flap bore striking similarities to effects seen in laboratory animals exposed to high-energy microwaves or other forms of directed radiation. The puncture marks, the hair loss, the skin damage, the anemic symptoms, all of these were consistent with some form of biological interaction with an unknown energy source. Whether that source was extraterrestrial technology, secret military experimentation, or something else entirely, has never been determined. Similar incidents have continued to occur in the region in the years since the main outbreak. Between 2013 and 2016, indigenous communities in the state of Acre reported encounters that mirrored the Colares events with unsettling precision, the same types of craft, the same harmful beams of light, the same resulting terror. In one case, an indigenous resident who fired a shotgun at a descending craft reported immediate retaliation and required hospitalization. Dr. Carvalho, the physician who treated so many victims during the original outbreak, later revealed that military authorities had pressured her to tell patients their injuries were merely hallucinations. She was compelled to lie, she said, in order to maintain calm and prevent further panic. The Air Force always asked her to say that nothing had really happened. The people of Colares know better. For those who lived through that terrible summer and fall of 1977, who watched their neighbors struck down by beams from the sky, who bore the scars on their own bodies, no official denial could erase what they experienced. Whatever descended upon their small island from the darkness above, it was real, it was hostile, and it left marks that have never fully healed. Yet the horrors visited upon the people of Colares were not without precedent in Brazilian history. More than 3 decades earlier, in another remote corner of that vast country, a single man had encountered something similar and paid the ultimate price in a manner so gruesome that his death remains one of the most disturbing cases in UFO literature. More than 3 decades before the Colares attacks, in the small Brazilian town of Guarapiranga, about 70 kilometers from Sao Paulo, another encounter with unexplained phenomena would claim a human life in a manner so horrifying that the case has become legendary among those who study such matters. The evening of March 4th, 1946, was a festive one throughout Brazil. It was Carnival Monday, the height of the country's most beloved celebration, and most residents of Guarapiranga had traveled to neighboring towns to participate in the parades and parties. The streets were empty, the houses were dark. It was a night when most sensible people were elsewhere, enjoying themselves. João Prestes Filho, a 44-year-old farmer, had never been one for festivals. He was a quiet man, uncomfortable with crowds and dancing, preferring the solitude of nature to the chaos of celebration. While his wife and 6 children made their way to the carnival in a neighboring village, João had spent the day fishing on the Tietê River with his friend Salvador dos Santos. The fishing had been good. As darkness began to fall, the 2 men packed up their catch and started home. They parted ways along the road, each heading to his own house. Salvador would later testify that João seemed in fine spirits when they separated, looking forward to a quiet evening alone while his family enjoyed themselves. What happened next would transform João Prestes Filho from an obscure farmer into Brazil's first recorded UFO fatality. According to the account João would later give before his death, he arrived home to find the house empty and dark, as expected. He entered through a window, his usual practice when the doors were locked. He was preparing to heat water for a bath when something caught his attention. Through the window, he saw a bright light approaching, moving with apparent purpose directly toward his house. Before João could react, the light struck him. He described it as a brilliant flash that penetrated the walls of his home, striking his body with tremendous force. He felt an immediate burning sensation spread across his exposed skin, his face, hands, neck, and lower limbs. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. In terror and agony, João fled his house. He managed to open the door latch with his teeth because his hands hurt too much to touch anything. He ran barefoot down the dark road toward the home of his sister Maria, a journey of some distance over rough terrain. By the time he arrived, his feet were bloody from the sharp rocks he had traversed in his desperate flight. When Maria opened her door to her brother's frantic pounding, she found herself confronting something out of a nightmare. João's skin had turned an ashen white. Burns covered his face, hands, and exposed limbs. He was barely coherent, able only to gasp that he had been burned, that something had attacked him, something that was not of this world. Maria summoned the local police chief, João Malaquias, who arrived to find a dying man. As the officer attempted to take a statement, he noticed something horrifying. The flesh around João's legs was coming away from the bone, falling off in chunks like meat that had been boiled too long. The victim continued to insist that his attacker had not been human, had not been anything he recognized from the normal world. More family members arrived. A neighbor with some medical training was summoned. Everyone who saw João Prestes Filho in those final hours would later describe the same impossible sight. A man whose body appeared to be melting, whose flesh was separating from muscle and bone before their eyes, who screamed in agony as he literally fell apart. João was transported to the hospital in Santana de Parnaíba, where doctors did what little they could for a patient whose condition defied all medical understanding. He lingered for approximately 9 hours before death finally released him from his suffering. The autopsy report raised more questions than it answered. The burns on João's body were classified as 3rd degree, the most severe category of thermal injury. Yet there were no signs of conventional burning. No kerosene or other accelerant was detected. No soot marked his skin. His hair and clothing showed no damage whatsoever. Only the exposed areas of his body had been affected. The coroner noted that the pattern of injuries was inconsistent with any known cause. If João had been burned by boiling water or fire, there would have been splash marks, gradual spread of damage, signs of conventional thermal trauma. Instead, the burns appeared almost precisely limited to areas of exposed skin, as if some targeting mechanism had been at work. Perhaps most disturbing was the speed of tissue deterioration. Burns, even severe ones, do not cause flesh to separate from bone within hours of injury. Whatever energy source had struck João Prestes Filho had done something to his cells that medical science in 1946 could not explain, and that medical science today still struggles to understand. When authorities investigated João's home the following day, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The window through which the light had supposedly entered showed no damage. The wood stove he had been preparing to light remained unlit. There was no evidence of fire, no scorching, no residue of any kind. It was as if the attack had occurred in some realm adjacent to the physical world, leaving traces only on the victim's body. The case attracted little attention outside Brazil at the time. This was 1946, a year before Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier would bring the term flying saucer into common parlance and launch the modern UFO era. João Prestes Filho died before most of the world had any framework for understanding what might have happened to him. It was not until 1971 that the case gained international recognition when a French magazine published an investigation conducted by Brazilian researchers. By then, many of the original witnesses had died, and documentation had been lost or scattered. But enough evidence remained to establish the basic facts of the case and to place it among the earliest and most disturbing examples of alleged UFO-related human fatality. Some researchers have proposed natural explanations for João's death. Ball lightning, a rare and poorly understood atmospheric phenomenon, has been suggested as a possible culprit. Spontaneous human combustion, another controversial concept, has also been mentioned. Yet neither of these explanations adequately accounts for the precision of the burns, the preservation of hair and clothing, or the rapid tissue deterioration that witnesses described. The family of João Prestes Filho maintained for generations that similar lights had been seen in the area both before and after his death. They spoke of a phenomenon that seemed to target their family specifically, though no other fatalities occurred. Whether these claims represent genuine observations or the natural embellishment of traumatic memory across decades of retelling is impossible to determine. What remains certain is that on a carnival night in 1946, a Brazilian farmer encountered something that killed him in a manner no doctor could explain. His flesh melted from his bones over the course of a single night, while his family watched in helpless horror. And whatever struck him down left no other trace, vanishing into the Brazilian darkness as mysteriously as it had appeared. 7 years after João Prestes Filho's agonizing death in the Brazilian countryside, another fatal encounter with the unknown would occur, this time involving not a farmer walking home from fishing, but trained military pilots pursuing an unidentified object on their radar screens. And like so many cases before and since, it would end with more questions than answers. The cold waters of Lake Superior have claimed countless vessels and lives over the centuries, their depths so frigid that bodies often never decompose, preserved in eternal darkness far below the surface. Native peoples who lived along its shores called it Gichi Gumi, the Great Sea, and treated it with appropriate reverence and fear. When European explorers and settlers arrived, they quickly learned to respect the lake's fury, its sudden storms that could transform a calm crossing into a watery grave. On the evening of November 23, 1953, Lake Superior would claim 2 more victims under circumstances so strange that the case remains officially unexplained more than 70 years later. First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncla Jr. was 27 years old, a Louisiana native who had dreamed of the sky since childhood. Born in the small town of Mansoura to a family of educators, he had initially pursued pre-medical studies at what is now the University of Louisiana before the call of aviation proved too strong to resist. He enlisted in the Army during the final years of World War II and later transferred to the newly established United States Air Force, where he earned his wings as a fighter pilot. By the fall of 1953, Moncla had accumulated more than 800 hours of flight time, including 121 hours in the F-89C Scorpion, the interceptor aircraft he would be flying on that final November evening. He was stationed at Truax Air Force Base in Madison, Wisconsin, with the 433rd Fighter Interceptor Squadron, but had been temporarily assigned to Kinross Air Force Base in Michigan's Upper Peninsula as part of the Air Defense Network, protecting the nation's northern border during those tense early years of the Cold War. Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson, 22 years old and fresh from Oklahoma, served as Monkla's radar observer, the second crew member required to operate the sophisticated interceptor's weapons and detection systems. The evening began unremarkably. At approximately 17 minutes past 6 local time, radar operators at the Air Defense Command Facility at Sault Ste. Marie detected an unusual target over Lake Superior, near the strategically vital Soo Locks that connected the upper and lower Great Lakes. The object appeared to be flying in restricted airspace where no aircraft was scheduled to be. In an era of heightened Cold War tensions, an unidentified radar contact over sensitive American infrastructure demanded immediate response. The decision was made to scramble an interceptor from Kinross to identify the intruder. At 22 minutes past 6, Moncla and Wilson lifted off into the gathering darkness and pointed their Scorpion toward the unknown target. Ground controllers tracked both aircraft on their radar screens, guiding Moncla toward an intercept as the object continued moving over the lake. The pursuit took the F-89 out across Whitefish Bay and deep into the open waters of Superior. Wilson, seated behind Moncla in the Scorpion's tandem cockpit, apparently had difficulty acquiring the target on his own radar, forcing the crew to rely on instructions from ground control to close the gap. For approximately 30 minutes, the chase continued. The unknown object seemed to be moving at speeds comparable to a jet airliner, fast but not impossibly so. Moncla gradually closed the distance, descending from his initial altitude to approximately 8,000 feet as he maneuvered for intercept. And then, something inexplicable happened. The radar operators watching their screens at Sault Ste. Marie saw the two blips, the Scorpion and the unknown object, gradually converging. At a point approximately 70 miles off Keweenaw Point, the blips merged. One moment there were two distinct returns on the scope. The next moment there was only one. The controllers assumed at first that Moncla had simply passed very close to the other aircraft, so close that the two returns had briefly combined. They expected the blips to separate again as the Scorpion completed its pass. But the separation never came. The single blip held for a moment, then altered course and accelerated away, eventually disappearing from radar entirely. Attempts to contact Moncla by radio received no response. The F-89's transponder signal had vanished along with its radar return. Something had happened out there over the dark, cold waters of Lake Superior, something that had swallowed Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson without leaving any trace. The search and rescue operation that followed was extensive and frantic. American and Canadian aircraft crisscrossed the suspected impact area. Ships altered their courses to scan the waters. Crews stared into the darkness, hoping to spot a parachute, a life raft, an oil slick, anything that might indicate where the men had gone down and whether they might still be alive. They found nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage. Not a scrap of clothing or equipment. Not a drop of aviation fuel. Lake Superior had swallowed the Scorpion and its crew as completely as if they had never existed. The initial Air Force statement to the press acknowledged the strange circumstances of the disappearance, noting that the jet had been followed by radar until it merged with an unknown object. This remarkable admission appeared in newspapers across the country, including the Chicago Tribune, which ran the story under the headline, "Jet to Aboard Vanishes." Then the story changed. Within days, the Air Force issued a revised statement claiming that the original radar reading had been misinterpreted. The unknown object, officials now asserted, had actually been a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 cargo plane that had strayed off course. Moncla had successfully identified the aircraft and was returning to base when he became disoriented and crashed into the lake. There was just one problem with this explanation. The Royal Canadian Air Force denied it. Canadian authorities stated categorically that no RCAF aircraft had been in the area that night. No C-47, no cargo flight, no plane of any kind that could have been the object Moncla was pursuing. The widow of Felix Moncla received conflicting explanations from different Air Force representatives. One told her that her husband had crashed into the lake while flying too low. Another claimed the aircraft had exploded at high altitude. Neither version matched the radar evidence that ground controllers had witnessed with their own eyes. UFO researcher Donald Kehoe, a former Marine Corps aviator who had become one of the earliest serious investigators of the UFO phenomenon, wrote extensively about the Kinross Incident in his 1955 book, The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Kehoe claimed to have received information from inside sources suggesting that the Air Force was actively covering up what had really happened that night. According to Kehoe's account, investigators at the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena discovered that any mention of the Kinross Incident had been systematically removed from official records. The Aerospace Technical Intelligence Center's response to inquiries was blunt. There was no record in Air Force files of any sighting at Kinross Air Force Base on November 23, 1953. Conspiracy theories flourished in the absence of satisfactory official explanation. Some proposed that the Scorpion had collided with an alien spacecraft, either by accident or after being deliberately intercepted. Others suggested that the aircraft had been captured, scooped out of the sky by beings who wished to examine its crew and technology. Still others wondered if the incident involved some classified military operation that the government was unwilling to acknowledge. In 2006, a group calling itself the Great Lakes Dive Company claimed to have discovered the wreckage of Moncla's F-89 on the bottom of Lake Superior, almost exactly where radar had tracked it, disappearing. Images purporting to show the aircraft resting intact on the lakebed were released to the media and sparked renewed interest in the case. However, subsequent investigation revealed the entire story to be an elaborate hoax. The company did not exist. The images were fabricated, and the supposed discoverers vanished as mysteriously as the aircraft they claimed to have found. The truth of what happened to Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson remains hidden beneath the cold, dark waters of Lake Superior. Their bodies were never recovered. Their aircraft has never been found. The object they were pursuing has never been identified. At Sacred Heart Cemetery in Moreauville, Louisiana, a memorial stone marks the loss of a native son who disappeared in service to his country. The inscription acknowledges what the official records attempt to deny, that Felix Eugene Moncla Jr. vanished while pursuing an unidentified flying object, and that neither he nor the answer to what happened that night ever returned. Nearly 3 decades would pass before another incident in American skies would leave witnesses with undeniable physical evidence of their encounter. But unlike Captain Mantell or Lieutenant Moncla, these witnesses would survive to tell their story, though the price they paid would be measured in years of suffering rather than instant death. The piney woods of East Texas stretch for hundreds of miles, dense forests of loblolly and shortleaf pine that have witnessed centuries of human history while keeping their own secrets in the shadows beneath their canopy. On the evening of December 29th, 1980, 3 people driving through this remote landscape would encounter something that would change their lives forever and leave them with injuries that medical science struggled to explain. Betty Cash was 51 years old, a businesswoman who owned and operated a grocery store and a restaurant in the small town of Dayton. She was driving her 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass that evening, returning home after an unsuccessful search for a bingo game with her friend Vickie Landrum, 57, and Vickie's 7-year-old grandson Colby. The weather was cold and clear. The roads were empty, and the 3 travelers had no reason to expect anything other than an uneventful drive home. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, as they traveled along a 2-lane road through dense pine forest north of Houston, they noticed a bright light in the sky ahead. At first, they assumed it was an aircraft approaching Houston Intercontinental Airport, which lay some 35 miles distant. They paid it little attention. But as they continued driving, the light grew brighter and closer. It was descending toward the road, directly in their path. Betty slowed the car, then stopped entirely as the object hovered just above the treetops, blocking their way. What the 3 witnesses saw that night has been described countless times in the decades since. The object was diamond-shaped, enormous, perhaps 50 or 60 feet tall, with flames shooting from its underside. The flames roared with the sound of a jet engine, an overpowering noise that filled the car even with the windows rolled up. The heat radiating from the object was so intense that Betty, who had stepped outside for a better look, found the door handle almost too hot to touch when she tried to get back in. Vickie and Colby remained in the car, terrified. Young Colby screamed and cried, convinced they were all about to die. Vickie, a devout Christian, believed she was witnessing the end of the world and began praying. The light from the object was so bright they could barely look at it directly. Then, impossibly, things got stranger. A formation of helicopters appeared in the sky, surrounding the flaming diamond. The witnesses would later count at least 23 of them, perhaps more, twin-rotor military helicopters of the type they recognized as Chinooks. The helicopters seemed to be escorting the object, or perhaps attempting to control it, as the entire strange procession moved away toward the east. The encounter lasted approximately 15 to 20 minutes. When the object and its helicopter escort finally disappeared into the distance, Betty drove the remaining short distance to Vickie's home, where she dropped off her passengers before continuing to her own house. Within hours, all 3 began experiencing symptoms that would only intensify over the following days. Betty, who had spent the most time outside the car in direct exposure to the object, suffered the most severely. She developed nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and a burning sensation in her eyes. Large, painful blisters formed on her skin. Her hair began falling out in clumps. By January 3rd, less than a week after the encounter, Betty's condition had deteriorated so severely that she was admitted to Parkway Hospital in Houston. She could not walk. Large patches of skin had sloughed off her face and body. She appeared to be suffering from severe radiation poisoning. Vickie and Colby experienced similar but less severe symptoms: weakness, skin irritation, hair loss, and eye problems. In the months following the incident, Vickie developed a cataract in one eye. Betty was later diagnosed with breast cancer, a disease that can be triggered by radiation exposure. The attending physicians were baffled. Betty's personal doctor, Dr. Brian McClelland, would later tell reporters that her condition was a textbook case of radiation poisoning, comparable to being 3 to 5 miles from the epicenter of an atomic bomb detonation. Yet there had been no nuclear explosion, no known radiation source anywhere in the vicinity of that lonely Texas road. John Schuessler, an aerospace engineer who served as deputy director of the Mutual UFO Network, began investigating the case shortly after the witnesses came forward. He visited the site of the encounter and found what appeared to be a large circular mark on the road surface, as if intense heat had somehow affected the pavement. A witness named Amy Mosley later reported that unmarked trucks had subsequently appeared and dug up that section of roadway, removing any evidence that might have remained. In August 1981, Betty and Vickie traveled to Washington, D.C., where they met with officials at the office of Senator John Tower. They hoped for assistance with their mounting medical expenses and for answers about what they had encountered. During the meeting, they noticed a map on the wall that appeared to pinpoint the location of their sighting, suggesting that someone in the government already knew about the incident. The military denied any involvement. No branch of the armed services would acknowledge ownership of the diamond-shaped craft or the helicopters that had accompanied it. When Betty and Vickie filed a $25 million lawsuit against the United States government in 1982, seeking compensation for their injuries, the case was dismissed for lack of evidence. The court ruled that the witnesses could not prove the military had operated the objects they encountered. Betty Cash never recovered from her injuries. She spent years in and out of hospitals, suffering from various ailments that her doctors believed stemmed from her radiation exposure that December night. She died on the anniversary of the encounter, December 29th, 1998, at the age of 69. Vickie Landrum passed away in 2007. Colby, now an adult, continues to seek answers about what happened to his family. The Cash Landrum case stands out among UFO incidents for several reasons. The witnesses were ordinary people with no prior interest in or connection to UFO phenomena. Their injuries were real, documented by multiple physicians, and consistent with a specific physical cause. The helicopters they observed were clearly military in origin, suggesting some form of government involvement, even if that involvement has never been officially acknowledged. What the three witnesses encountered on that Texas road remains officially unknown. Whether it was a secret military craft undergoing testing, an extraterrestrial vehicle being monitored, or pursued by American forces, or something else entirely has never been determined. The only certainties are that something was there, that it caused real physical harm, and that those responsible have never come forward to explain themselves. The radiation burns suffered by Betty Cash and her companions were horrifying enough, but they paled in comparison to what would be discovered 8 years later near a reservoir in Brazil, where investigators would find evidence suggesting that whatever was responsible for cattle mutilations around the world might also be conducting similar procedures on human beings. In September 1988, authorities in Sao Paulo, Brazil, made a discovery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the limits of human cruelty and perhaps the nature of the universe itself. A body was found near the Guarapiranga Reservoir, mutilated in ways that seemed to defy any conventional explanation. The victim was a male adult whose identity was later established, but has been kept confidential at the request of his family. He had been dead for approximately 48 to 72 hours when discovered, yet his body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, an anomaly in the tropical Brazilian climate where organic matter typically breaks down rapidly. The condition of the corpse would haunt those who examined it. Both eyes had been removed, extracted with what appeared to be surgical precision. Both ears were gone. The tongue had been excised. The genitals had been removed entirely. The digestive organs were missing. Multiple small, perfectly circular holes, seemingly punched through the skin with some kind of tool, dotted the body's surface. Despite extensive tissue removal, there was almost no blood at the scene or in the remaining body. It was as if the victim had been drained completely before or during the mutilation process. The official autopsy report concluded that the wounds had been inflicted while the victim was still alive, and that the associated pain had been so intense that it likely caused cardiac arrest. In other words, the man had been tortured to death in a manner that suggested advanced surgical capability, but absolute indifference to human suffering. The case initially received little attention outside local law enforcement circles. It was not until 1993, when photographs from the crime scene and autopsy were obtained by UFO researchers, that the Guarapiranga case gained wider notoriety. The researchers who examined the evidence were struck by the similarities between the injuries inflicted on this human victim and those documented in countless cases of cattle mutilation reported throughout the Americas since the late 1960s. The same surgical precision, the same removal of specific organs, eyes, ears, tongue, reproductive organs, digestive tract, the same absence of blood, the same circular puncture marks. Cattle mutilations had long been associated with UFO sightings, with witnesses reporting strange lights in the sky on nights when animals were found dead and disfigured. Many researchers in the field had speculated about whether the phenomenon might extend to human victims. The Guarapiranga case suggested that it might. Brazilian ufologist Encarnacion Garcia obtained the case files through her friend Dr. Rubens Goes, whose cousin worked as a police technician and had access to the photographs and autopsy documentation. The evidence was subsequently examined by multiple investigators, including representatives from American UFO research organizations. What they found was deeply disturbing. The pattern of injuries matched too precisely to be coincidental. The removal of specific sensory organs, the extraction of reproductive and digestive systems, the drainage of blood, the small circular penetrations. All of these elements had been documented repeatedly in animal mutilation cases linked to UFO activity. Some investigators proposed that the case represented proof that whatever intelligence was responsible for cattle mutilations was also conducting similar operations on human subjects. Others suggested that the similarities were merely coincidental, that the victim had fallen prey to some particularly sadistic human criminal whose methods happened to resemble those attributed to unknown parties. The truth has never been determined. Police were unable to solve the case or identify any suspects. No witnesses came forward. No murder weapon was ever found. The victim had simply been taken, mutilated with precision that suggested either advanced medical capability or something beyond human technology, and discarded near the reservoir where his body would eventually be discovered. Reports from Brazil suggest that similar cases may have occurred both before and after the Guarapiranga discovery. Law enforcement sources have hinted at additional bodies found with comparable injuries, though documentation has never been made public. The families of victims, understandably, have not been eager to subject their lost loved ones to the scrutiny of UFO researchers and the sensationalism of tabloid media. Whether the Guarapiranga case represents evidence of extraterrestrial activity, secret human experimentation, or some other category of horror remains unknown. What cannot be denied is that a man died in agony, his body violated in ways that seem designed to extract specific biological materials rather than merely to inflict pain. These cases represent only a fraction of the documented encounters that ended in tragedy. From the skies above Kentucky to the waters of the Bass Strait, from the coal yards of Yorkshire to the Amazon Delta, ordinary people have encountered something extraordinary and paid for that encounter with their health, their sanity, or their lives. What these phenomena truly represent remains unknown, but their effects are undeniably real. If you found these stories compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps us continue exploring the unexplained. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.